Okay, so let's at least try to get through half of chapter 20 on the heart. And so we're continuing in the circulatory system and looking at the structure and function of the heart. And I think you all pretty much have an idea what the heart does and its importance, and even have some idea of the anatomy of the heart. So first of all, cardiology is the scientific study of the heart and the treatment of its disorders. So a cardiologist would be a what? A heart specialist. Good. So the major divisions of the circulatory system, we've mentioned these before. Remember the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit? So remember the pulmonary circuit includes the right side of the heart, and the path from the right side of the heart, like the right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricles, to the lungs and back to the heart. So that is the pulmonary circuit, and it's called the pulmonary circuit because the right side of the heart is responsible for what? Carrying blood to the lungs and back to the heart. Okay? Carrying blood to the lungs for what purpose? For gas exchange, right? So at the lungs, what type of gas exchange takes place? Okay, so the blood that enters the lungs is what? CO2 rich. So that CO2 in the blood entering the lungs will be exchanged for oxygen. So that CO2 will be released at the lungs. Oxygen is picked up at the lungs. And when blood returns back to the heart, it is now what? Oxygen rich. Okay? And then the systemic circuit takes that oxygenated blood and does what? So when this oxygen rich returns to the left side of the heart, what happens to it? The left side of the heart does what? Pumps the blood where? For what purpose? So the left side of the heart pumps blood to all the rest of the body, all of the other tissues and cells of the body. And what happens once the blood reaches those tissues? Another gas exchange occurs, right? So that oxygen-rich blood at the tissues, you have exchange of CO2 for oxygen. So the oxygen goes into the tissues, and CO2 comes out of the tissues and into the blood, and then that is sent back to the right side of the heart. Okay, so I hope you all remember that forever. Okay, so circulation in the heart. Circulation, so we have a continuous one-way circuit of blood vessels. So blood only goes in one direction, and that's why we can predict that a drop of blood or one blood cell, as it leaves the right atrium, will return to the right atrium because it is a closed loop or closed circuit. And what is the job of the heart in this circuit? Right, so the heart provides the force needed for blood to actually move. Without the heart, blood just sits there. So there's never any gas exchange if blood is not moving. So blood is propelled by the pumping of the heart. All right, so this is pretty much a repeat of what we just said. The left side of the heart, fully oxygenated blood arrives from the lungs to the left side of the heart via the pulmonary veins, and blood is sent to all organs of the body via the aorta. So the aorta is the first artery receiving blood from the left side of the heart, and it is responsible for distributing blood to the arteries, which carry blood onto the particular tissues. The right side of the heart contains lesser oxygenated blood, and so the right side of the heart receives that CO2 rich blood from the inferior and superior vena cava. So where does the CO2 come from? See if you all remember. So we say blood is CO2 rich. Where's the CO2 coming from? Huh? From the cells, right? The tissues, their cells. What do the cells get CO2 from? Where do the cells get CO2 from? It's the waste product that comes from. Where does CO2 come from? So we know some parts of the blood is CO2 rich, right? And some parts of the circuit. Where does the CO2 come from? How does CO2 get in the blood? Yeah. Okay, so for the test, you all are going to have to be able to tell me how oxygen gets into the blood, how CO2 gets into the blood. Where does oxygen come from? From the lungs, right? So the way that oxygen gets into the lungs is when we inhale, oxygen comes into the lungs and then into the blood. The question I just asked is, how does CO2 get into the blood? Where is it coming from? From what cells? Tissues, right? So every cell of the body sends CO2 into the blood. Where do the cells get the CO2 from? Cell respiration. So the same process that makes ATP makes CO2. Remember that equation? Glucose plus oxygen makes ATP, water, and CO2. So the cells make CO2 when the cells are making ATP. Don't forget that. Okay, so the CO2 is a waste. So the cells get rid of it by sending it to the blood, and then the blood gets rid of it. Where? You look so confused. Yeah. So how does the body get rid of the CO2? So the cells make CO2 during cell respiration. That CO2 is sent into the blood, right? And then back to the heart, and then to the lungs, where CO2 is released. Okay. Y'all got it? Don't forget it. I'm going to ask you all again Monday, maybe in a quiz. All right.
You don't have a test?
No. The test is Wednesday. Unless you're ready Monday. All right, so where's the heart? So the heart is located in the center of the chest, but it's kind of tilted. The apex of the heart is tilted to the left, as you see in this picture. And the apex is the tip, and you can see the way it tilts, but it is in the center of the chest, in the area called the mediastinum, between the lungs. And so the heart has a base and an apex. The base is the wide superior part of the heart, and then the apex is the inferior tapered part of the heart. And the heart of a typical adult weighs about 10 ounces. The heart wall, and you all should remember these from the figure that you had to label a couple weeks ago. What was that, last week? So there's an epicardium, endocardium, and myocardium. So epi, the prefix epi means above or upon. Very good. So that is the outer covering of the heart, and it is a serous membrane. Remember the visceral pericardium from Biology 201? Visceral pericardium is that membrane that covers the heart. And so the coronary blood vessels travel through the epicardium. The endocardium, endo means inner, so the inner membrane that lines the inside of the heart chambers. So the atria and ventricles are lined by this covering, this membrane, and that is the endocardium. So the blood that is actually in the chambers is in direct contact with the endocardium. And the endocardium also covers the valves surface and is continuous with the endothelium of blood vessels. So in the next chapter we'll talk about the layers of the blood vessels, but the inner layer of all blood vessels is made up of endothelium. That's just a single layer of epithelial cells. Okay, and then myo, what does the prefix myo refer to? Muscle. Good. So the myocardium refers to the middle layer of the heart, which is really the bulk of the heart. So most of the heart is myocardium, and that is the cardiac muscle is referred to as the myocardium of the heart. And there you see a little bit of the detail there. The endocardium lining the inner chambers of the heart, and then the thick middle layer, which is the myocardium, and then you have the epicardium, which is part of the pericardium. And a couple of terms. So pericarditis. Pericarditis will be inflammation of the pericardium, and that causes painful friction when the heart beats. It kind of rubs against neighboring tissues, and that's somewhat painful. And what would endocarditis be? Inflammation of the endocardium. Okay. So this just goes into a little bit more about those layers. Heart wall, the chambers. So the 4 chambers of the heart are the right and left atria and the right and left ventricles. And you should have an idea of how blood moves through those. You have the path, which is the starting point, but the heart is referred to as a double pump. You have the right side, which pumps CO2-rich blood to the lungs, and the left side pumps oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. And there's that question again. Where does the CO2 in blood come from? Tissue cells. And how do... Good. Okay.
So
All right.
you want tissue instead of cellular?
Both. Understand it so you'll know both ways. Yeah. All right, so the heart is as a double pump. So what you see here are the circuits, and notice the colors. Remember what we said the colors represent? So when you see blue, what does that represent? Blue? Blue is oxygen poor or CO2 rich. Red is oxygen rich. So look at the sides of the heart. So the right side of the heart is full of CO2 rich blood. Okay? And these represent the capillaries of like the legs and other organs carrying that CO2 rich blood back to the right atrium by way of the inferior and superior vena cava. Okay, so there you can kind of see the path of blood, which you all already know. And here's the path as well. And remember one other thing. So you first have the 2 atria contract. So the 2 atria contract simultaneously, the right and left atria. And you should know where blood is going. Whenever the atria are squeezed, blood falls down into the right and left ventricle. Okay? Remember what we said about the thickness of the myocardium of the left and right ventricle? Notice in the picture, the myocardium is thicker on what side? So the left side of the heart, the left ventricle, has a much thicker wall than the wall of the right ventricle. Why? Think of its function. So the right ventricle is pushing blood to where? The right side, the blue side. So the right ventricle is pushing blood to where? To the lungs and back. Right? So that's what that force is supposed to do. Send blood to the lungs and back. Not bad. Not going too far. The blood is not having to go too far. What about the left side of the heart? So the blood that's in the left ventricle has to go everywhere. To my feet. So that force, the force of the left ventricle has to be strong enough to push blood to my fingertips and back to the heart. To my big toe and back to my heart. So which one has to be stronger? The left side of the heart has to be stronger because it's pumping blood a greater distance. So that's why the myocardium is thicker on the left side than the right side. Does this mean that there's more blood on the left side of the heart than there is on the right side of the heart? So there's not?
Oh, yeah.
No. I like to get you off.
So that's how you get some test.
No, the reason I'm telling you now is so you won't mess up on that. Because that question will be on the test. So I'm telling you now. Okay?
Relationship of hemoglobin and red blood cells.
Okay. You got it now? What is it? What is the relationship between hemoglobin and red blood cells?
Hemoglobin and red blood cells.
That's it. What's so hard about that? What's so hard about it?
Relationship is so much more.
Okay, but that's it. That's it. So the left side of the heart has the exact same amount of blood as the right side of the heart. One side is just stronger. Okay? And we'll see that there are problems that will arise if one side has just one drop more blood than the other. That causes heart failure and other serious problems. So the two sides of the heart have to have an equal amount of blood. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. All right. And what did we say the function of the valves is? So, partly, but the preventing part is the function. So what does it prevent? Yeah. So remember that valves, the heart valves, look at the tricuspid valve. And you can pretty much see what it does. So when blood squeezes, when the ventricle squeezes or contracts, blood is going to be pushed from the ventricles up, right? There's nowhere else for blood to go. So it's going to try to go back up into the atria. But those valves, look at the shape of them. So since the valves are shaped this way, when the blood tries to push back up into the atria, the blood actually pushes the valves closed. So you can almost imagine squeezing here will push the bottom of the valve so the valve closes. So blood does not shoot back up into the right atrium or the left atrium. Instead, it goes in that one direction that blood has to go in. Okay? So think about how this is designed. That's the amazing thing. Just think as if someone made the heart. Just think if you had to create the perfect heart so that blood goes in one direction. You would have to make those valves that way and not this way, right? Otherwise, when the ventricles contract, blood will shoot back up into the atria, and then fall back down, but blood would never what? Go anywhere. It would just keep going up and down, up and down. So that had to be made that way. The ventricle walls had to be stronger on one side so that the heart would be strong enough to force blood all over the body. Okay? And so those are just some things to think about. So when the atria contract, that's called atrial systole. Let's see if we have those terms on here. So that's the path of blood you all know about. Where's systole? Well, we'll come to that in a second. I thought that was coming up next. So the systole means contraction. Diastole means relaxation. But we'll see that in a moment. All right, so the four valves. So have an idea of the names of those four valves and what their specific function is. So in general, valves prevent blood from going backwards. So it continues to go in the forward direction, one direction. So they ensure a one-way flow of blood through the heart. And what are the four valves of the heart? Tricuspid, bicuspid. What's the other name for bicuspid? Left AV or mitral valve. So the bicuspid valve is also called the mitral valve, and the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are right AV and left AV, atrioventricular. And where does that name come from? That's where they're located, between the atria and ventricles. Okay? So the atrioventricular valves, and then the other two are called semilunar valves. You have the pulmonary semilunar, and that semilunar means half moon, and that's the way they're shaped. And pulmonary semilunar and aortic semilunar. And these are referred to as exit valves because blood exits through these valves when blood leaves the heart. The AV valves controls blood flow between the atria and ventricles. And the chordae tendineae cords connect AV valves to the papillary muscles on the floor of the ventricles, and that prevents the AV valves from flipping inside out or bulging into the atria when the ventricles contract. And the semilunar valves, again, allow blood to leave the two ventricles. Okay, so this is just another view of those valves, the AV. So notice the opening into the aorta and pulmonary. So notice those valves kind of have cusps, kind of half moon shaped, and they're slightly different, a slightly different form from the tricuspid and bicuspid valve. All right. Another thing about this picture is kind of a weird view of the heart, but you can see what part of the heart, if you look at the picture at the top, what part of the heart we're looking at. And we're just looking down onto the heart. The coronary circulation. So remember the coronary arteries? You all remember that? Those arteries on the heart, on the surface of the heart. What is the purpose of those arteries? The coronary arteries, coronary circulation. So let's just take another look at it. So you have the right and left coronary arteries. And so the coronary artery's job is to supply oxygen to the heart tissue. All right, so every tissue of our body has to have adequate oxygen and glucose. The heart is no different. So what would be the result of blocking one of these coronary arteries? Myocardial infarction, right. So what's happening there? So just as if I were to cut off arterial flow to my finger, what would eventually happen to my finger? Right, the cells would die. So if there is blockage of the coronary arteries, wherever that blood is going, like the left ventricle myocardium can die. So keep in mind that the coronary circulation provides oxygen and nutrients to the cells of the heart itself, the cells of the heart wall, the myocardium. And I wanted to show you this because for most of our body, blood is pushed when the ventricles contract. So the ventricles contract, pushing blood forward. But when the ventricles relax is when blood falls into the coronary circulation. So blood is not forced into coronary circulation. It's kind of a passive process. When blood tries to, if you can think about, let's see if you can visualize this. If I can help you here for a second. If you find a picture of the heart and think about, yeah, that's a pretty good one. So think of what happens when the left ventricle squeezes. Where's blood going? So when we squeeze the left ventricle, what's the next place blood goes to? The aorta, right? And then, of course, forward. So when the ventricle relaxes, what is the blood in the aorta trying to do? Right. It's the same thing. So it's physics. If you squeeze blood from the ventricle, it's going up into the aorta. If you let the ventricles go, blood tries to fall back down into the ventricle, right? But what prevents that? The valve. And once the valve is closed, blood then falls into the coronary circulation. So that's what I mean when I say blood is not forced into the coronary arteries. It actually waits for the ventricles to relax and blood try to fall back down into the ventricles. Then it goes into the coronary circulation. Okay, so if the coronary blood vessels are blocked, that's going to make it hard for blood to get through the blockage. So just imagine if there's blockage here, plaque buildup. Since nothing is forcing blood through there, you can imagine that that's going to cause a problem with the tissues in the lower part of the heart from getting oxygen and nutrients, and that is myocardial infarction. So coronary circulation, 5% of blood pumped by the heart is pumped to the heart itself through the coronary circulation to sustain its strenuous workload. And remember, the heart muscle is constantly going. It never stops, right? Once it stops, we stop. So 250 milliliters of blood per minute is needed by the coronary circulation. And the heart, since it's contracting, is going to need an abundant supply of oxygen and glucose. So the coronary arteries, this tells you what parts of the heart is served or provided nutrients for the left and right sides of the heart. Okay, and this is just another view showing you how the heart receives the blood flow from the circulation. All right, contraction of the myocardium compresses the coronary arteries and obstructs blood flow. So that's what I was just mentioning, that blood flows into the coronary circulation when the ventricles relax. Angina pectoris, you need to know what that is. Chest pain from partial obstruction. So the key word there is partial. Partial obstruction of coronary blood flow. And again, the most common cause of that obstruction is a buildup of plaque on the inside of the arteries. Cholesterol, for example. So if the coronary arteries are like this, and that's obviously too wide, but if there's plaque buildup in here, that limits the space that blood can flow through. So there's going to be less blood flowing through that coronary blood vessel. So what does that mean? there's less oxygen and glucose getting to the actual cells of the heart, the myocardial cells of the heart. So the pain is caused by ischemia of cardiac muscle. We've seen that word before, ischemia. Ischemia, you all know what that is? Decreased blood flow. Okay, so decreased blood flow, which means decreased oxygen and nutrients getting there. So there's obstruction partially blocking the blood flow. And the myocardium shifts to anaerobic fermentation. So when a person is about to have a heart attack, sometimes they'll feel pain. And the pain actually comes from the same thing that causes us pain when we're doing push-ups or crunches. So eventually your abdominal muscles, if you're doing crunches, start to burn, right? And start to get sore. What's going on there? You all remember with your muscles, if you overwork them. Right, so remember, our muscle cells use aerobic respiration, right, to make 36 ATP, but it can only do that when there's adequate what? Oxygen. So if the cells don't have enough oxygen, they switch to anaerobic respiration, which only allows them to make 2 ATP per glucose. So with angina, there's not enough oxygen getting to the tissues of the heart, so the heart cells start making ATP by anaerobic respiration. Remember when anaerobic respiration occurs, there's a production of lactic acid. So the lactic acid, it was what causes burning of your skeletal muscles. It was the same thing that causes that same burning or pain of the heart.
So the acid that's present is what makes people think that it's like ingestion.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. So you have to be careful with that.
Is it possible to have like a mild heart attack and not know it?
Mm-hmm. Yep. In fact, I've heard of people having a heart attack and not know it. All of a sudden, they may just start being really tired and not know why. I mean, just one day you may be able to get out of the bed and walk out to your car, and the next day you have to stop and take a breath 5 times before making it to your car. But some people just think it's indigestion and keep on going. But that, if you're tired all of a sudden, that should send you to get checked out to find out what the problem is. So the myocardium shifting to anaerobic respiration is what causes the pain. So how is angina pectoris different from myocardial infarction? So they're similar. The difference is, remember, angina pectoris was partial, the key word was partial, blockage of the coronary circulation. Myocardial infarction is complete blockage or interruption of blood supply to the heart from a blood clot or fatty deposit. Okay, so either of these, anything that causes blood not to be able to get through the coronary arteries to the heart wall, the cells of the heart, will cause a heart attack. So this can cause death of myocardial cells within minutes. If blood is not getting to those cells will die just like any other tissue. There is some protection, however, from myocardial infarction by what's called arterial anastomoses, and that's where there's a network of blood vessels interacting. So if one blood vessel is blocked, per se, there's another route to the same tissue. So that helps out a lot of people. Before they have a heart attack, there may be 3 vessels blocked. Okay, so the anastomoses helps to protect from a sudden death of the heart. All right, so sudden death of a patch of myocardium resulting from long-term obstruction of coronary circulation. Okay, so angina pectoris usually occurs ahead of myocardial infarction. And myocardial infarction is responsible for about half of all deaths in the United States. Silent heart attacks occur in diabetics and elderly. Well, and that is remember that was one of the effects of diabetes. People who have diabetes when it gets to the latter stages. Heart attack can occur, and that is due to the heart having to work too hard. Remember, there's an increase in blood glucose level, and that thickens the blood somewhat. So some painless heart attacks may disrupt electrical conduction pathways, leading to fibrillation and cardiac arrest. And I'll go over this, if not today, on Tuesday, Wednesday. Heavy pressure or squeezing pain radiating in the arm. So you may hear that if a person's having a heart attack, sometimes they'll have pain in their arm. And that's referred to as referred pain.
Is that the right arm only?
The left arm.
Left arm.
Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is because the pain signal from the arm, pain signals from nerves of the arm and nerves of the heart are transmitted to a similar part of the brain. So the brain kind of gets confused on whether the problem is in the heart or the arm. That's called referred pain. I don't think we may have mentioned that in earlier chapters. All right, cardiac conduction system. And this is an important part of the chapter. And so the cardiac conduction system controls when the heart beats. Okay, so the cardiac conduction system, I like to think of it as a nervous system within the heart that sends out electrical signals, sort of like neurons have electrical signals, and those electrical signals stimulate the muscles of the heart to contract at a particular time. Okay? So follow along with me, and after we go over this, that'll be it for the day. So electrical energy stimulates the heart muscle. So there are two nodes that you should be familiar with. They are the SA node, or sinoatrial node, and that's on the atria, and the atrioventricular, which is the AV node, and it's found between the atrium and ventricle, which the name tells you. So these two nodes are going to fire, sending electrical signals that stimulate other parts of the heart, as we'll see. And then you have the AV bundle branches, and Purkinje fibers. Let's look at a picture. I think it's always better to look at a picture of the heart as we go through this. So on this picture you can see the SA node as well as the AV node. You see those? So the SA node is what we call the pacemaker of the heart. It sets the heart rate. When it fires, that's when the heart is signaled to contract. Let me step back a second. These two words here, these terms. Myocytes are myocardial cells. Okay, so myocytes are myocardial cells. The heart is said to be myogenic. Make sure you all understand what that means. The heart is myogenic, and what that means is that it can naturally contract and relax on its own and doesn't need the nervous system in order to contract. Okay? So our skeletal muscles cannot contract unless they receive a signal from what? The nervous system. The heart is different. The heart doesn't need a signal from the nervous system. So that's what we mean by myogenic. The muscles can contract or generate their own action potentials without the need of the nervous system. Now remember, the nervous system does have an effect on the heart rate, right? Sympathetic and parasympathetic affect the heart rate, but they don't They're not needed in order for the heart to contract. And that's because the heart is myogenic, not neurogenic. Skeletal muscles are neurogenic. Okay? And finally, autorhythmic means that the cells of the SA node can initiate action potentials at a constant rate. So the heart sets its own heart rate. The heart is autorhythmic because the cells of the heart set the heart rate, the pace of the heart. And that is, of course, through the pacemaker, which is the SA node. Okay, so the heart cells have action potentials of their own. All right, now follow along with me on this part. This is the important part. So here's how the heart contracts. So the SA node fires first. When the SA node fires, notice the red arrows. When the SA node fires, it stimulates the left and right atrial muscle cells to contract. Okay? So the SA node fires. That sends an electrical signal to the muscles, the myocytes of the atria, the left and right atria, telling them to contract all at one time. Okay? Y'all got that? So the SA node is the pacemaker. When it fires, the atria contract in response to the electrical signal generated. Okay? That electrical signal from the SA node at the same time stimulates the AV node. See if you all can follow that looking at the picture. It's always better to visualize it than memorize a bunch of words. Okay, so hopefully looking at the picture you can see that when the SA node fires, what is it stimulating? The left and right atrium. And it's also going to stimulate the AV node. Okay, now if you look at the AV node, what do you think it's going to stimulate? Right, so look how the signal from the AV node is probably going to pass down through the AV bundle, the atrioventricular bundle here, and then the bundle branches to the left and right what? Ventricles. So that electrical signal, and again, think of this as neurons. So it signals down the branches, and then those at the very end are stimulating the actual muscles of the ventricles. Those are the Purkinje fibers. You can see the Purkinje fibers receive the signal from the bundle branch and stimulate the ventricles to contract. Okay? So on the test I may ask you which node is responsible for contraction of the atria? SA node. Which node is responsible for the contraction of the ventricles? AV node. Good. See the pathway there. Now, back to that magnificent design of the heart. Why would you want... So first what you have is the SA node telling the ventricles to contract. There's a pause. The atria to contract. There's a pause, and then the ventricles contract. So the signal has to go from the AV node all the way down to the apex of the heart before the ventricle starts to contract. Why not make all four chambers contract at the same time? Exactly. So it would squeeze out and come back, right? So you would want to squeeze the atria, push that blood into the ventricles, then squeeze the ventricles to push the blood forward. So the heart had to be designed that way so that the atria know to contract all together, and then the ventricles. Another amazing thing about it is think if the way the heart is made, when the ventricles do contract, the bottom of the ventricles contract first. So it's like squeezing blood upward. Whoever designed the heart could have made the top part of the ventricle contract first. But would that make sense? If we squeeze the top part of the ventricle, Exactly. So this stuff is amazing to me. So the ventricles squeeze from the bottom up, so you have to wait for the signal to get all the way to the apex. So when you hear lubbed up, think about your heart sound. Lubbed up, lubbed up. So those are due to the contraction of the ventricles. And actually the sound is coming from the closing of the two sets of valves. Okay, so this is the conduction pathway. So again, the SA node fires, sending a signal to the what? The left and right atria for them to contract. SA node also sends a signal to the AV node, which sends a signal down to the bundle branches, and the Purkinje fibers, which stimulate the ventricles to contract from the bottom up. So the left and right sides of the heart work together. So you have systole. There's what I was looking for earlier. The word systole means contraction. So when the atria are in systole, the ventricles are in diastole. So diastole means relaxation or resting. And when you look at an electrocardiogram, you see something like this. So this is a normal EKG. So what the EKG or ECG is really the correct letters, because electrocardiogram has a C. But what this is a composite of all action potentials. So remember, action potentials occur in the AV node, the SA node, and the cells of the heart, the myocytes. So the electrocardiogram is a composite of all the action potentials of nodal and myocardial cells, amplified and recorded by electrodes that are placed on the arms, legs, and chest. So notice what you have in this recording. So you always see a P wave, then you have the QRS complex, and then you have a T wave on all normal EKGs. Okay, so remember those three waves: P wave, QRS complex, and T wave. And for the test, you'll need to know what is happening during each of those. And the answer is right here. So what is happening during the P wave? During the P wave, the SA node fires. So the SA node sends a signal to the atria, the muscles of the atria. Those muscles of the atria depolarize, and that, of course, will cause contraction of the atria myocytes, the atrial myocytes. So atrial systole. What did we say atrial systole is? Contraction of the atria. Okay, so that is all happening during the P wave. During the QRS complex, you have the ventricles depolarizing. So notice there's a slight gap between the end of the P wave and the beginning of the QRS complex. So there, the AV node is getting the signal to the ventricles. The ventricles depolarize, and then the ventricles contract during the ST segment. So that would be after the QRS complex that you have ventricular systole. And then during the T wave, you have ventricular repolarization. Remember what that word means? Going back to resting potential. So the cells go back to resting potentials, and the ventricles relax. Okay? And this is very helpful in determining what types of problems a person may have with their heart. And go through this picture. This kind of helps you to see what the heart is doing during the particular parts of the EKG. So you have atrial depolarization beginning at step number 1, and that's because the SA node has fired, atria depolarize, and atrial contraction. And then it shows you what's happening with the rest of the heart as the EKG continues forward. So what the EKG can tell us is what abnormalities may occur in the conduction pathway. What is the conduction pathway? Right. So that whole pathway starting at the SA node, AV node, that is all the conduction pathway responsible for telling the heart muscle cells when to contract. Myocardial infarction. So any of these abnormalities can be detected on an EKG. Enlargement of the heart, nodal damage, electrolyte and hormonal imbalances. We don't go deeply into this in this class, but there are just some slight things you'll need to know for the test. So for example, the ECG that you see at the top of the page is a normal rhythm. So whenever we have a normal rhythm, it's referred to as a sinus rhythm. So the SA node and AV node are firing properly. And notice that you have the P wave, the QRS complex, and the T wave. Look at the picture on the bottom. Doesn't look right. What's not right about it? So notice in that second ECG, there is no P wave. So that tells you something about the heart. The heart is not doing, right? So now that you know what each wave represents, this is the easiest one to tell what is not happening with the heart. So that means the SA node is not firing, right? Because we said the P wave is where the SA node fires and depolarizes the atrium. Okay, so that would be something we call a nodal rhythm. A nodal rhythm occurs when the SA node is not firing. And there's something else I want to say about that. Write down somewhere nodal rhythm. So a nodal rhythm occurs when the SA node is not firing, but the AV node is. So the AV node takes over as the pacemaker. When a person has a nodal rhythm, when a person has a nodal rhythm, their SA node is not firing, so the AV node takes over as the pacemaker. And the problem here is the heart rate only gets up to about 40 to 60 beats per minute. What's the normal heart rate for adults? So the sinus rhythm, a normal sinus rhythm, would have your resting heart rate between what? Between 60 and 100 is considered normal. Okay, 60 to 100 is a normal resting sinus rhythm when you're at rest. And it's probably usually between 70 and 80, but like I said, 60 to 100 is still considered normal. And again, we're talking about at rest. So with a nodal rhythm, a person's heart rate, normal resting heart, well, not normal, but resting heart rate will be between 40 and 60 beats per minute. So you have an idea then of what the issue they may have. If your heart rate can only get up to 40 beats per minute, what are you likely to be doing? Right, sitting down a lot, not able to go up a whole flight of steps without stopping and getting a breath. Okay, so some people who have a nodal rhythm end up getting a pacemaker. Okay, and then there's something called, write this one down too, intrinsic ventricular rhythm. Intrinsic ventricular rhythm. That's another abnormal rhythm that occurs when the SA node and AV node are both malfunctioning. So if the SA node is not firing and the AV node is not firing, the person has an intrinsic ventricular rhythm. And their heart rate is only between 20 and 40 beats per minute. So they're just in bed all day. Can barely get up and go to the restroom. Between 20 and 40 beats per minute. Look in your book for me and let me know if you have pictures of the ECG. Any abnormal? 687?
689.
Okay. Let me see if I can get those on the PowerPoint. I hadn't seen those before. But looking at those, you should be able to tell, again, depending on where the abnormality is in the ECG, what part of the heart is damaged or what part of the heart is not functioning properly. So take a look at those. You won't have them on the test, but it's just good information for you all. Okay. On the test, I will have you all to label. I mean, this is the easy part, where you have to label the waves, the P wave, the QRS, and T wave. But I'll also ask you, so for the P wave, I might have A. For the QRS complex, I might have B. For the T wave, I might have C. And I may ask you, which of these, ventricular depolarization occurs at which? Actually, I have an A, B, C. C at between the ST segment. So the ST segment is actually between the QRS wave and the T wave. So I ask you, which of these, A, B, C, or D, is where you have ventricular depolarization? A, B, C, D. Look, well, the ST segment. Remember the ST segment? Right. Okay. Yeah. So the ST segment is where you have.
You're asking for what interval?
Right. So I would have a letter at each point, and I say, which of those points would you expect ventricular contraction, which is ventricular systole. Okay. So that's how you need to know those. All right. That is it for the day.